The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson and Late Night with David Letterman will be delayed 1/2 hour due to the following NBC News special.
NBC News presents Black Athletes, Fact and Fiction.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Tom Brokaw, and welcome now to Black Athletes, Fact and Fiction, Part 2. In the course of the next half hour or so, we hope to answer the questions that may be left over from our 1-hour examination of this controversial and yet important issue that exists in America today. Why are black male athletes especially dominating the most popular sports that we have? We have a panel of experts with us. We have a studio audience as well. We'll be meeting them in just a few moments. But first, for those of you who were not with us earlier this evening, we want to show you a summary.
What we are seeing is black athletes being reduced to gladiators in the entertainment service of a predominantly white society.
Who leads the way, and like a streamlined express, he sets the pace for America's sweep to victory.
In Black Athletes, Fact and Fiction, we saw how blacks have come to dominate the major sports in America. The explosive question, why?
The blacks, physically, in many cases, are made better.
Coach, this business about black athletes, do they have a natural advantage?
Physiologically, anatomically, anthropomorphically, no.
But we found that blacks do appear to have a genetic edge. Black babies are biologically more advanced than whites. Blacks acquire motor skills earlier, and studies show some of the advantages persist into adolescence. Anthropologists have determined that black adults have relatively longer arms and legs and less fat on their extremities, an edge in running. Comparisons of muscle tissue suggest that whites have more light fibers, good for endurance. Blacks have more dark, fast twitch muscles. That may help them in quick burst running and jumping. Finally, we came to see that many people, black and white, think blacks are naturally superior athletes, and why some say that's a racist, backhanded compliment.
That's the racist attitude that blacks are natural because they're naturally lazy, so anything they get, they don't get from hard work. They get because God just gave them the right gene pool.
And what about a thinking athlete?
Well, we know damn well he's a white person because white people have the cerebral capacities that blacks don't possess.
I know the American system is very sensitive to statements of blacks and white, but you cannot defy science. Things are facts. I think it's to the advantage of the black athletes to be proud that God was on their side.
It is, as I say, an explosive subject, and here to discuss it with us tonight are some people that you saw in the course of that program and some others, beginning with Dr. Harry Edwards, who's the well-known sports sociologist from the University of California at Berkeley, author, a consultant to Major League Baseball and to the San Francisco 49ers. Arthur Ashe, who hardly requires an introduction. He's one of the premier tennis champions of America, the author of this free-volume study on black athletes called Hard Road to Glory. Dr. Richard Lapchick is with the Center for the Study of Sport and Society from Northeastern University, and he has studied many of these subjects as well. In Brussels tonight, two of the scientists who were prominent in our program, Dr. Claude Bouchard, who is from Laval University in Quebec, he is on your right, and Dr. Robert Molina, who's the University of Texas anthropologist. The purpose here, let me hasten to point out, is to develop some knowledge, some understanding, to know the facts from the fiction tonight. We are joined as well in our studio by interested parties from New York area universities and colleges and from sports participation groups. They'll be with us tonight, and I'm sure that they'll have questions as well. Let me also point out that this program tonight concentrates primarily on black males who dominate the major sports today. It wasn't a deliberate attempt to somehow overlook the great achievements of women, black or white. But the phenomenon in American sports is that black males are now dominating the big sports that we're all so familiar with, and they're doing it at a qualitative level never before seen. Let's go to Brussels to begin our discussion tonight with Dr. Claude Bouchard. Dr. Bouchard, one of the most, I suppose, significant developments that we saw in the course of the program tonight is you're finding that blacks have more of the so-called fast twitch muscles, the muscles that are useful in explosive events such as running and jumping. Let me ask you, can that not be acquired? You were testing primarily adults. Isn't it possible that those black adults that you were testing acquire those fast twitch muscles in the course of their youth in West Africa primarily?
It is indeed quite possible. And as a matter of fact, the question of the fiber type is only one aspect of the issue. What we have found is more than that. We have found that the blacks that we have studied, who were, by the way, totally sedentary, had more of the proteins that are associated with the capacity to generate the high level of contraction that is required when you perform in high intensity power performance type of events. And the difference with the whites that we measured, we used French Canadians as control, was very striking. Of course, some of that can be acquired, but we measured them in a state where they were totally sedentary for a long time, and they were matched against a comparable Caucasian group.
Dr. Harry Edwards, you can see that there may be some physiological differences between the races, but you contend, and I'd like you to address this to Dr. Bouchard, if you would, that these are primarily culturally acquired differences.
We have a much more basic and fundamental problem here, and that has to do with the whole concept of race itself. We know, for example, that the African-American population arose generally from an admixture of European-American, Native Aboriginal or Indian stock and African stock. Therefore, the issue emerges, how black does one have to be in order for this thing to make any sense that they're talking about? It is also the case that if it is indeed something having to do with our African heritage, then it would appear to me that West Africans would be dominating in all of these various areas, especially in international sports and sprints and so forth, rather than African Americans, since we have been watered down, so to speak. And you can see this in any general population of blacks. We approximate every color of the rainbow, and we didn't get that way by looking out the window too much or watching too much TV. So what we have to begin to deal with is the basic concept of race. How black does one have to be in order to have these fast twitch muscles?
Well, let's ask that to Dr. Bouchard. What about that, Dr. Bouchard?
Well, true. The black subjects that we have in our study were from West Central Africa. So they were not comparable to the American blacks that we are talking about, that Dr. Edwards has been talking about. In that sense, I think we have a better understanding of the racial differences, because as we know, in the American black population, there is a fairly large amount of gene admixture with the Caucasian, with the white.
Then those individuals should be the great basketball players and sprinters and not the African American blacks. Is that correct?
No, well, I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying that there is apparently a clear biological difference.
Well, let me ask you, Dr.
You know that more than biology to make an athlete, of course.
Yeah, but that's the very point that you've made as well in the past.
Yeah, that's the point that I have made relative to the fact that most such studies run into the same problem that this gentleman is having in terms of trying to explain his interpretation of the data. The reality is that blacks who do achieve outstanding records and performances in these sports that we're focusing upon are indeed superior athletes and superior physically and physiologically, but not just to whites, but to other blacks as well. That's how they got to where they are. You're looking at a very selective population. One more thing, though, I would like to pose. Given the fact, as the philosopher Kant said, that concept without precept is empty, unless one is prepared to suggest that the anticipation of being outstanding football and basketball players led to development in the past of these particular characteristics. What was it about the African-American experience over the last 400 years, since we're obviously not talking about anything that happened in Africa, given that we're an admixture and not pure African, what was it in the African-American experience over the last 400 years that led to this differential evolution of black Americans as opposed to the general population?
Let's ask that of Dr. Molina, if we can, who is Dr. Bouchard's colleague and who has done wider studies in that area. Dr. Molina, can you address that, if you would?
Well, in terms of the development of the black population in the United States, sure, you're talking over the last 300 or 400 years, and there have been varying degrees of admixture. But I think Harry is getting at an interesting point. in terms of looking at what might be the precursors of performance. And I think to approach it in a purely biological way or to approach it in a purely social way, I think you're missing the point. The key is biology and social conditions do not exist in isolation. We must approach these together. The two obviously interact. If you've got the right biological requisites for sport, the right environmental conditions under which these requisites can be expressed, you have a much better chance of achieving success. And I believe if we are to look at the issue of race and sport, you must do it in a biosocial or biocultural context and look at those conditions, or you might say determinants, that might bring about the potential for performance, to realize this potential if it's there. And you're talking about relatively small differences. But if we could nurture them with different environmental conditions and look for the answers in the environmental conditions under which individuals are reared. How is a youngster socialized into sport? How does a youngster come about with these particular characteristics that make him or her successful?
Let me ask Arthur Ashe a question. Are you comfortable with this conversation so far?
Oh, yes, very comfortable, yes.
Have your friends been concerned that just by raising this kind of an issue that it's racist somehow in its overtones?
Oh, it's certainly a sociological red button, no question about that. And people are afraid that the inference or the causality will be drawn that if blacks are proven to be physically or genetically superior as athletes, then they will be proven to be mentally or spiritually deficient somehow. Those two sort of go together, and they have for a long time. People have tried to make this causality, and it's not, there's no connection.
We're going to take a break right now. We want to come back in just a few moments and talk about the whole subject of racism and whether or not American black athletes are treated as gladiators and the other issues that come into play in this important topic of black athletes, fact and fiction. We'll be back in just a moment. We're back now with many questions of black athletes, fact and fiction tonight, and one of our guest panelists tonight is Richard Lapchick, who is for the Center for the Study of Sport and Society from Northeastern University. Dr. Lapchick, you have been a student and scholar of these many issues. Do you think that most whites in America see black athletes merely as performers or as gladiators in some fashion, and is that denigrating in your judgment to them?
I think that most whites do see that, and it is definitely denigrating. I think that the great danger here is that, first of all, a small danger is that young white kids are going to drop out of sports altogether and won't pursue it, but much more importantly, so many more black children are going to pursue that professional dream, believing that this genetic makeup, if they believe this, would lead them to be pros, and in the process lose the chance, as so many have over the past few generations, of getting a real education by overemphasizing sports and de-emphasizing their educational balance.
And has society, black and white altogether, failed to deal with this in an effective way?
When 27% of our Division I basketball players graduate from college, we can say we have a major failure of our higher educational system, yes.
Another one of the scientists who participated in tonight's program is Dr. GIDEON, ARIEL, who did the jumping study that everyone was watching very carefully. Listen, there's an obvious question here. If blacks have superior jumping ability, why are the dominant high jumpers in America today Chinese and Swedish and Soviet citizens?
Well, of course, in athletic performance, such as Olympic sports, you need specific skills, specific training, and many other components. However, you need some genetic makeup. Athletes don't make the sport. Sport actually make the athletes. Every sport has certain characteristics that the elite, if they meet these characteristics, they're going to excel in the sport. And like Dr. Edwards said, there is many other factors affecting this kind of thing. So if you take a Chinese athlete that you train him with special equipment and you allow him to optimize his genetic makeup, he can break the world record. On the other hand, if you take, for example, the East Germans, which will select their children from 2-3 years old, put them in special schools, and train them the rest of their life, because this is all their life, they have tremendous motivation. And they might lose the game if they don't have the genetic makeup that other athletes have. So it's all based to science.
And some of our guests here today or this evening as well, have some questions for us. Steve Gibbs, who is an athlete who's here tonight. Steve Gibbs, where are you? Right here. Could we hear? We'll have a microphone for you right now. You have a question.
Definitely. My question is for the scientists. I'm just curious as to find out how objective, how objective can you possibly be, since you're obviously out to prove your own credibility?
Well, it does make difference who will do the test. If I let you do the same test that I did, you will get the same results, because I'm dealing with gravity, I'm dealing with forces. I'm not cast an opinion. I mean, anybody can let a person jump on the force platform and find out what are the forces.
And let's ask Dr. Bouchard and Dr. Molina about that. Dr. Bouchard, what about that?
Well, we took a sample of the skeletal muscle, and we look at the proteins, at the fiber type, and we find that there are differences. There are, most of the blacks are probably comparable to Caucasians in terms of their skeletal muscle makeup. But there is a subgroup of blacks that we found who definitely add some characteristics in their muscle which are generally associated with the capacity to succeed in high-intensity, short-duration activities. That's it. It doesn't mean that all of them can become athletes, but they probably have an advantage when exposed to the activities of training and the exercise to perform better.
Dr. Molina,
there's no judgment on that.
Let me ask you a question, Dr. Molina. Two questions, actually. Is it possible that your tests are racially biased, as some blacks charge that SAT tests are, for example? And what happens to a young black man or a young black woman raised in an affluent neighborhood who's not much interested, for example, in becoming an NBA basketball player?
In the studies of motor performance, those tests are fairly objective, been used for many, many years. They're very standardized tests performed under standardized conditions. And in a number of studies in which they're able to control for social class factors, the apparent racial difference is specifically in vertical jumping and in running speed persists. In other words, within the same social class, even for controlling styles of child rearing, black youngsters still jump better and run faster. And the interesting thing to me is these data began to appear in literature after Jesse Owens' success in 1936. The first studies appear about 1938. And since 1938, the results are fairly consistent over time. There have been no reversals. And if there was any major trend or shift in environmental conditions, you might expect a reversal. But over the last 50 years, the data are reasonably consistent over time, specifically for males, not so for females.
Harry Edwards, I know that you're eager to
this is, I mean, I didn't come 3,000 miles to sit here and engage in sophistry and satire. What we're looking at here is a situation. I have yet to see a study where there was an adequate control in terms of class factors, particularly as it related across so-called race lines, oppression, differential motivation, differential cultural emphasis. You cannot talk about lower class or underclass whites in the same bag as lower class and underclass blacks. Different worlds. The second point is that even were you able to distinguish these differences, it doesn't mean that they have anything to do with an outstanding athletic performance. For example, this gentleman's jumping test. You know, to say that you got 16 athletes and you were able to distinguish the blacks from the whites by the ability to jump once they were basketball players, that's like telling me that my nose has 2 holes in it. I already know that. What we're looking at is the question of why. And on top of that, if he's inferring that jumping ability has something to do with rebounding, for example, in basketball, or jump shooting in basketball, that's nonsense. 80% of rebounds are taken below the rim. And if you talk to somebody like Bill Russell, who has the greatest career average in terms of rebounding, he will tell you that he took from 80 to 85% of his rebounds below the rim. It has to do with hard work, intelligence, and being a student of the game.
All right, Dr.
I agree with you asking the question why. That's the point we need to do. We should find out, why do black children in general perform in certain events better than white children? Why do blacks perhaps have a better chance of becoming an athlete? We need to look at the why question, and that is in, I believe, the whole socio-cultural matrix of growing up. What does sport mean to a child? How do they become socialized into sport? We need to address those in an objective way. And to dismiss it simply as being a social or dismiss it as being racist, I think is very myopic. We must approach it objectively.
That is not what I'm saying. What you're essentially doing now is arguing my point. That of course there are physical and physiological differences because you have a disproportionate number of African Americans in this country with that kind of potential who are channeled towards sport as a result of a lack of alternative high prestige occupational opportunities. But it is the social environment and the racism and so forth that accounts for that. That is what we have to focus on.
What in the social environment brings it about? That's the key. Let's look for that. What is it in the social environment? We need to address that issue. I believe we need a biosocial or biocultural approach. To dismiss one at the expense of the other is, I just think, a narrow view of the world.
I would not suggest that we dismiss one. I would suggest that the only difference between black and white accomplishment in American society over the course of the occupational structure and over the span of each group is racism and discrimination and a legacy of that.
Arthur, actually, you agree with that?
With you there.
I agree with Dr. Edwards, yes, I do. There's no question we start screening our athletes much earlier. By the time you're 13 or 14, you are so good, you have come through such a tough screening process that everybody else is encouraged to actually sit down and watch.
But in the program tonight, you said in your heart you believe one thing.
Oh, yes. Well, in looking for 6 years at the data, going way back to the early 1800s, there were just so many examples of blacks who, out of the clear blue sky, did awfully well. But my head tells me that, hey, I really don't believe there is any difference.
All right, Dr. Lapchick, we'll be back to you, and we'll be back to some questions from the audience right after this. We're back with part 2 of Black Athletes, Fact and Fiction. We have been talking about the enormous impact on the black athlete in this country of culture and environment and the other opportunities that are just not available to them. Dr. Richard Lapchick is with us as well tonight from the Center for Study of Sport and Society. Do you agree that that's 99% of the equation?
I do, and I think it's instructive what Dr. Molina said. Since 1938, after Jesse Owens' victory, we've been trying to develop scientific studies that prove that the blacks are genetically different than whites. I've never been convinced, and I don't think Harry or Arthur has been either, that we've come up with that scientific study. We've not looked at East German athletes genetically. We've not looked at Asian athletes genetically. We've always focused on the black American athlete. And I think the question is, why have we done that?
Prove, though.
Go ahead, Dr. Molina.
I don't think the studies were aimed to prove. Most of the studies were, just let's look at comparisons. And the study of human variability is a fairly straightforward thing. And one of the basic comparisons is between American black and American white children. I don't believe they were designed to prove anything. They're just part of the objective nature of comparison, and the results are reasonably consistent over time. And incidentally, most of the studies on performance are based on non-athletes. These are studies of the general population. And of course, athletes come from such a small segment of the general population.
Have there been studies, by the way, between blacks and Orientals and between blacks and Hispanics, or whites and Orientals, or whites and Hispanics, or has it always been primarily a black-white equation?
It's been primarily black-white, but there are a number of studies comparing Hispanics, mostly Mexican-Americans in the Southwest. And typically what you see with regard to motor performance, Mexican-American boys and white boys perform pretty much the same. And in studies that had all three for same social class, black boys generally perform better than white boys and Mexican-American boys in these specific tests of running and jumping that we spoke about earlier.
But pardon me, Dr. Molina, isn't that in and of itself a kind of a racist statement that you've confined it to only the two other groups, and they both happen to be economically deprived minorities in this country?
But in those early studies, they're all from the same background, and the important thing is they're the ones most often compared.
All right. Ed Beglin is the assistant basketball coach at Manhattan College. He's here with us today as well.
Yes, Dr. Edwards, I'd like to know if you've performed any studies to support your statement that black athletes are superior due to cultural reasons, and if so, what have those studies shown?
I have studied this problem since my graduate days at Cornell University. In fact, I wrote my dissertation on the myths and realities of American sport, and have looked at and reviewed every piece of information that has come down the pike for the last 25 years in terms of this situation. A fundamental tenet of the social sciences is that human capability is fairly evenly distributed across all populations, and that race itself is of questionable scientific, biological, and genetic validity. And therefore, the onus of proof is on those who would devise and determine that some scheme that alleges that there is some race-linked difference between blacks and whites. In fact, the one constant thing that I have seen in the literature, and the one constant thing that constantly comes up, is the flawed nature of the studies that have been done, including defining who is black. Is it one drop of black blood? I'm forced to trace my ancestry back to Africa, despite the fact that I have a perfectly good great Irish granddaddy, not because that blood and those genes are not flowing in my veins, but because we live in a racist society where if you have one drop of black blood, 1/32nd, octoroon, quadroon, mulatto, it doesn't matter, you're black. And so that social and political definition flies in the very face of the categorizations that they're trying to set up. When you say this is a black group, you're already in trouble.
Dr. Bouchard, you have a response to that. Let me just say, by the way, Dr. Edwards, that other scientists have conducted these studies, and we had great difficulty in getting any of them to share their findings with us because we do know that it's a very controversial issue in society today. Dr. Bouchard, you want to respond to that. Dr. Bouchard and Dr. Molina were at least willing to come forward. Dr. Bouchard?
First of all, we must be clear. There has been no genetic studies comparing black and white in terms of their gene characteristics affecting performance. The only data that we have are comparison of two groups, one black African group and one white Caucasian group. That's it. That's not a genetic study. Secondly, when we look at the genetic data, though, which have been accumulated over the years, it's quite clear that indeed, like Dr. Edwards said, there are not too many differences between the various races, blacks, whites, or Asians, in terms of genetic characteristics. It's commonly recognized that at the most, 10% of human genetic variation is specific to one human race or group, but 90% is shared by all human individuals, or all Homo sapiens. So the probability that the genes are affecting performance is rather remote. It's, you know, we have only a 10% genetic difference among the races. But we cannot eliminate the possibility. And in these skeletal muscle comparison that we made, we find an intriguing difference in favor of the black athletes coming from West Africa, the black individuals coming from West Africa, for the high-intensity power performance. But then that black individual might be at a disadvantage in terms of the endurance performance.
Dr. Bouchard, let me ask you a question that a lot of people have asked me, quite honestly. When I told them that we were doing this program because I thought there were a lot of half-baked theories out there that we had to deal with as much fact and knowledge as we possibly could, they kept saying to me, why would you want to do this? Let me ask you a question. Why would you even be interested in conducting these studies, these comparative studies? What do we gain from that?
Well, I have always been working under the hypothesis that knowledge is the greatest safeguard against prejudice. Ignorance fosters prejudice. And if we can understand the biological basis of performance and why some of the biochemical or molecular characteristics are important in performance, and if some of the human groups of mankind have more of these characteristics than others, then we will understand, and knowledge is the important thing here. Don't forget, I'm also coming from a minority group, and every time I open my mouth in America, people understand that I'm from a minority group, and I've never been against the notion of studying the differences between the Francophone or the Anglophone of this continent.
Philip Kump is in our audience tonight as well. He was the young black basketball player that you saw from Philadelphia. And somewhere here tonight is Terry Williams from Columbia. Is he here? Where is Terry? Terry and Philip share something. We saw how hard Philip worked, and we heard from him earlier this evening. But Terry Williams has some observations as well. You're, what, a football player and a track athlete at Columbia?
Yes, first of all, my name is Terry Brown, to correct you.
Oh, I'm sorry, my researcher didn't help me with that.
That's quite okay. And I'd just like to make a comment that as an African-American athlete, I am quite disturbed not only by the nature of this program, but by the hidden undertones that also are quite evident. There's an attempt to present this program as an informative documentary, which would both give facts and dispel myths and fiction about Afro-American athletes. But what I see here is not only the undertone of racism, but also fear and concern. Historically, blacks have been discriminated against in the fields of athletics, academics, and economics. And now that we see that blacks have overcome in the field of athletics in such a dominant force, in a dominant way, that there's a fear and a concern that we may also do that in the fields of academics and economics. The racism comes into play that we cannot applaud the African-American athlete for his superiority, but we have to downplay that superiority and find a reason for it and make the claim that that reason is because he is physiologically superior, and that it's not because anything that he's done on his part, no hard work involved, but it's just that God was on his side. I believe that's what the doctor said. So, you know, we African-American athletes get no credit. This whole program says we're superior, but we're not superior because we work at it. We're superior because God did it for us.
Well, no, in fairness, in fairness, Mr. Brown, when we showed Philip Kemp, for example, we showed not just that he was a black basketball player who was grown full-blown from his baby's crib. We showed how hard, in fact, he worked at it. We had Dr. Edwards on here tonight talking about the importance of hard work and the environmental factors that go into that, and the cultural environment that Dr. Molina mentioned tonight, that there are too few opportunities for blacks in other areas, and what we attempted to do here was to deal with some of the other half-baked theories that exist out there, because a good many people, I think, do believe that great black athletes just walk onto a floor or onto a football field or onto a track and set world records just by their natural ability. And what we wanted to do tonight was to attempt to set this in some kind of a context. There were those people who said, you know, it's a no-win proposition. You're not going to make anybody happy, and that may be the case, but the fact of the matter is that the pursuit of knowledge, it seems to me, is better. We have, in my part and the part of all the people who worked in this program, I don't think there's any question that the great black athletes that we see today, or the great white athletes for that matter, get to where they are primarily by working very, very hard at their craft. That's why some of us are in television today and not playing basketball, as a matter of fact. Dr. Lapchak, what about what Mr. Brown had to say here tonight? Undertones of racism throughout the whole program?
I think the study of the subject, not necessarily in this program, but the historical 50 years we've spent trying to seemingly prove that there are the differences that Dr. Molina or Dr. Bouchard might feel, underlines a racial dimension to the issue and always has. We accept black dominance as athletes, but we don't accept it in intellectual matters, and the white society is willing now to accept that black dominance on the playing field, but we're not willing to give up control in the classroom, in the government, in the corporate world, and I think that's the dimension we're really talking about.
Arthur, what about it? Do we set it back, the whole question of racial understanding in the society, racial sensitivity, by talking about it in this way, or do we move it forward, or is it a wash?
No, I think we illuminate the problem a bit more than it was, and certainly going back to the time when Charles Darwin started his studies resulting in Origin of the Species and Herbert Spencer, I saw study after study after study after study, which all changed when blacks broke new barriers, and each study tried to prove why blacks were superior in an area where they were not superior before. And that the danger is, of course, as I said earlier, is that whatever results are achieved or seen or evidence in the tests, that they will try to use those tests to prove that, yes, we are athletically superior, but academically, as Mr. Brown says, inferior.
And Harry Edwards?
Well, I think that all due respect to Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and the soaps and football games and Super Bowls and so forth, I think that this is why television was really created. I think that to the extent that you refuse to deal with controversial issues in an open society, then you push them underground where they take root and spread faster than ever. I'm elated that the situation is being aired and openly discussed, and I would welcome anyone who holds views opposite to mine, most certainly, to join me in any kind of a forum to debate the issues, and I think that that's the way we educate people about what's really going on.
Dr. Edwards, thank you very much. Harry Ash, Mr. Lapchak, Drs. Bouchard and Molina in Brussels, thank you very much for being with us tonight. Dr. Gideon, Ariel, especially to our members of our studio audience here. Many friends and my colleagues as well wondered why we would raise these issues at all. Well, it seems to me that these issues are important, as Dr. Edwards said, to society, so that we know each other better, so that we see each other more clearly, so that we deal with the facts so far as we are able to determine them instead of the half-baked theories that exist out there. Ultimately, I hope that this program will prove to be, in fact, a kind of a tribute to the place of black athletes in America, a tribute to the hard work that they have all put into their great sports and to what they have done, and we have seen some of that here tonight. Thank you all very much for being with us. I'm Tom Brokaw for all of us at NBC News.